Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to this distinguished gathering. I have no expertise in your fields. I've been brought here as a historian on the grounds that a little bit of history and culture won't do you any harm. But as you know, the Chinese have many, many cultures in that vast country, and they claim a long, long history. So it's really quite a job to say, how can I talk about the subject with a short period of time? But let me try and give you some of my views about what I consider to be of interest and of relevance to, I believe, what is happening today. And that's a big claim, but I stand by it and hope that you will not disagree with me too much. The theme I would like to talk about is really modernizing China. Both words, modernizing and China, are very important here. Modernizing, by modernizing, of course, I refer to what the Chinese consider to be modernizing, what they call 现代化, to modernize, to become modern. And it started out as westernization, and it's become modernization in the recent decades. Behind it all are, to me, basically two stages, or maybe three, but using the two key words in what has happened in the last 100 years or so. And the two words are reform and revolution. By reform, I refer to the period when the West came to China, broke open the Chinese imperial security blanket, and led to a series of wars which undermined the sense of security that the Chinese had had for a long time before that. The Qing dynasty was under threat, and that was pretty obvious. So they realized after their series of defeats on the coast of China, and the unequal treaties that they had to sign, and the concessions they had to make in the treaty ports, they had to reform. And by reform, I mean they do not question the foundations of what was a great civilization with the historical pride that all Chinese had in their civilization. There was no need for that. The foundations were secure. All was needed was to reform it. That some things had gone wrong, and we could improve on it and make it better, and then we can make China secure again. So that period of reform lasted for about, well, half a century at least, and it was a very obvious thing. They started with defense, because they've been defeated at sea. So the first and the most important item of reform was defense of your coastline. You needed a navy. So maritime power was something that they had ignored and neglected for too long, and therefore they were vulnerable, and that proved to be the total undermining of their whole sense of security that they had for so long. They now felt not only just threatened by other people with bigger navies or better navies, but actually by a whole new civilization, which offered a whole series of transformations which the Chinese Mandarin elites of the time, towards the end of the Qing dynasty, could not accept. They said there's no need to accept. Our system was basically sound, and we can just improve on it. Reform was enough. And they set about it pretty seriously with attempts to build up a navy, to build up maritime power, and they concentrated on what they thought was the necessary bits of industrialization that was needed to strengthen their defenses, and a bit of capitalism to improve their capacity to compete against the new industrial capitalist economic systems that were threatening the whole economy or the agrarian economy of China. And they thought they were capable of doing that. They were not at all insecure. In fact, right down to, I would say, to the 1880s, they were still pretty confident that they could handle it. In fact, their own sense of security within the country, insofar as their continental side of their empire was concerned, the Qing Empire was quite confident they could handle the continental side, and indeed, in fact, crushed several rebellions, but domestic and on the frontiers on the continental side. It was the naval side, the maritime side, that they thought they had learned a lesson. They should never ignore the sea again. They must always have maritime security. And I think that was the first lesson. The second lesson, I think, at least for me anyway, that needed for us to pay attention to was that they discovered that the Chinese people were now free to leave and go out of China, the so-called overseas Chinese. Right through from the Ming Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty, they had a ban against Chinese going overseas. That ban actually persisted right up to 1893 before the ban was actually lifted. So in other words, throughout the 19th century, there was still a ban on Chinese leaving China to trade overseas and have dealings with the foreigners. Any Chinese dealing with foreigners was suspect and highly discouraged, if not severely punished when they returned. That was a law. But in fact, of course, they have been gradually relaxing this and not treating it too seriously for quite a while. But again, at the end of the 19th century, their officials, when they set out to become the new generation of diplomats to serve the empire in various parts of the world, especially in Western Europe and also in the Americas, they discovered almost everywhere there were Chinese, particularly in Southeast Asia, among the colonies of the British, the French, and the Spanish and the Americans after that, and the Dutch, of course, in the Netherlands, East Indies. And there were not only many of them, millions of them, and many of them are very rich and successful, and in fact had been fully adapted to the new cultural changes, the so-called Western entrepreneurial methods, and even the legal systems of the West that they encountered in the colonies. And so they paid attention to these people because these Chinese who have been abroad and been successful and made their fortunes there knew something about the West and could probably help the Qing government deal with the West without the Qing government having to change anything fundamental to their own system. So the combination of securing maritime security by learning how to have a navy and by making use of all those Chinese abroad who understood something about the West and who bring their knowledge home and help the Chinese imperial government as well as Chinese coastal entrepreneurs to deal with the industrial capitalists that were now dominating the treaty ports. So these were, I think, the two takeaways I would say from that period of reform. But as we all know, it was a little too little and too late, and it didn't succeed. But despite that, right up to the end of the century, the classic example of the Chinese response to all these changes that were threatening China was the famous statement by the, I think, Viceroy of Huguang, Zhang Zhidong, in his famous book on learning, the act of learning, which he talked about the fact that the foundations of Chinese civilization are perfectly sound. And what we needed to do was to learn how to use Western learning to enable China to secure itself and fend off all these enemies. So back to the point about reform. In fact, right up to the end, even after they were defeated by the Japanese in the Sino-Japanese War, even after that, the fundamental statement was still 中学为起，西学为用. Chinese learning as foundation, Western learning for use. To use it to reform and change and strengthen China again and defend China against all its enemies. But to conclude on this point, little too late, and it didn't save the Qing dynasty. And within just a little over a decade after this famous statement was made, the Qing dynasty collapsed. So we have revolution. The next word, revolutions. But as we all know, the word revolution is a very Enlightenment, French in origin, and European, and you might say the crux of modernization in Europe was the two revolutions of France and the United States. They marked, at least in the eyes of most people in the world, those are the two revolutions that made the big difference. But of course the West uses the word revolution for many other things. We talk about revolution in science, revolution in commerce, and in the capitalist system, the banking system, whatever it is that had a major transformation, you use the word revolution. The Chinese never had that meaning. The Chinese use the word革命, which of course actually the Japanese use the word革命to translate revolution, and to them,革命in the Chinese context was really just a change of dynasty. It could also mean, of course, a little bit more than that, a regime change in the more modern terminology, but it was essentially a change of dynasty. The mandate of heaven has been taken away from one dynasty and given to the other because the other side won on the battlefield. That's the simplest formula I can give you to the idea of革命. But in the eyes of the modern Chinese at that time, they equated革命to revolution. And that was the first revolution. It meant it was a revolution of, we of course identify with the Sun Yat-sen's revolution and the Nationalist Party that eventually formed a government in 1928. And they were responsible for getting rid of the Manchus and establishing a republic. But what was really revolutionary, of course, was the fact that they no longer had a dynasty. It was a republic, and it was sovereign in the Western legal, the international law sense, a sovereign state. That was the idea of sovereign state never occurred to the Chinese. They were always there. It was never needed that word was never needed. But here was a sovereign state in the eyes of the world. And that position was new to the Chinese, but it gave the legitimacy that Sun Yat-sen and his rebels wanted. But as you know, he didn't take over from the Qing. It was handed to Yuan Shikai, and the reason for it, this is itself very important. The international position of China, in a way, depended on that. And the fact that Sun Yat-sen was totally ignored by all the powers when he set up, or tried to set up, his government in Nanjing, and totally ignored. All the missions, the embassies in Beijing simply ignored it. No government recognized it. And they would only recognize it if there were, as it were, a legitimate transition from the Qing to another new dynasty, maybe. So Sun Yat-sen gave up the presidency and gave it to Yuan Shikai on the basis that if he persuaded the Manchus to legally hand over power to a new regime, Yuan Shikai would be the first president of the Republic of China. Yuan Shikai, as you know, was a military man who was at that point the most powerful military man in Beijing, and at the point when the Manchu aristocracy was totally demoralized and totally incapable of handling the situation, and they were persuaded to give in to this request on the promise that Yuan Shikai made to them that if they did so, no Manchu would be killed. The usual change of dynasty can be very bloody. The Yuan Shikai promised the Manchu change of dynasty would be bloodless, and indeed it was. No Manchu was killed. The imperial family was allowed to stay in the Forbidden City, remained there for another, 15 years or so. So that legitimized the change from a dynastic, Confucian dynastic state to a sovereign republican state of the Republic of China in 1912. And at that point, 1912, the whole international community recognized the Republic of China as having inherited the legitimate position, their legitimacy from the Qing dynasty. And by that they meant they inherited the whole of the Qing legacy, recognizing the territories of the Qing as now being the territory of the Republic of China. At least so it was assumed in international law. And it was not challenged for a while. But underneath it all, of course, this was quite a different situation altogether. And as you know, China was far from being united. it remained divided by warlords, militaries of one kind or the other for the next 20 years or so. And it took two other movements, a powerful nationalist movement led by Sun Yat-sen and his followers, and an increasingly growing movement led by the opposition to that, by many, many young people who were completely disillusioned with the system that was passed on from the past and wanted a complete revolution. And this is what they meant, not a change of dynasty, but a complete revolution, as in the French and the American example. And for that, they were prepared to completely abandon the ancient Chinese civilization and replace it with a modern civilization. Again, to sum it up very quickly, among the slogans, the best recognized one by Chen Duxiu in his article in the New Youth was science and democracy. And it was widely accepted. And for science, there was no question at all. That was obvious. Democracy was also obvious, but they probably had different understandings what exactly democracy meant. But nevertheless, this was accepted. And with that were other slogans which became more and more extreme. One of the most extreme was, of course, the very famous one about 打倒孔家店, destroy the whole Confucian heritage. That's as far as they went. Whereas, of course, the elite, the Mandarin elite and their supporters and their families and so on, still retain a great affection for the old system and really wanted to be reformed rather than revolutionized, were the losers. They eventually fought this radical attempt to transform everything, to the point when I would add another slogan, which was not so widely accepted as 打倒孔家店, the destroying down with Confucianism, but almost as widely accepted was 全盘西化, a willingness to learn from the West altogether. They used the word West at that time, but eventually what they really meant was, as it turned out almost by everybody, to use the word modern instead of West, replacing the West, but almost understood that modernization was a high degree of Westernization, universally understood. And the Chinese more or less accepted that, especially among the young generation, and they took that to be the way forward. The only way to save China was to go be prepared to go as far as that. And that, of course, is a subject of great debate for a long time. So you can see that for at least those years between the foundation of the Republic of China and its eventual failure to defend itself against the Chinese Communist Party, it was a major debate of what the future of China should be like. But of course, in the middle of all that, they were still continually being, you might say, interrupted by civil wars among the militaries, foreign intervention in supporting one warlord against the other, and of course, in the end, the final blow was the Japanese invasion. And the Japanese invasion was, I think, what really awakened the Chinese to the new concept, totally new concept of nationalism. The Chinese had never been a nation. They had no idea what a nation was. The nation that was defined by the West, evolving from the Treaty of Westphalia, that nation was something that the Chinese never understood, and I think even to this day struggle to understand. But the point about it was that was the call. You needed nationalism to save China from Japanese conquest of China. And for about a decade or so, that became the slogan that almost replaced all the other slogans, to save China from being totally conquered again. And the least acceptable to the Chinese at that time was to be conquered by the Japanese. So it was Japanese invasion that really stimulated more and more, especially the young generation, to become nationalists and turn nationalism into a new ideology that at the time people noted that we've been drawing inspiration from the fascists and the Nazis in Italy and Germany, from which the Kuomintang was prepared to receive aid, assistance, and training in order to fight the communists in China. So the choice between nationalism on the one hand and nationalism to defend, as it were, the interests of what would be the elite classes of the past, the descendants of the mandarins, and the people who are new entrepreneurs and new capitalists of the treaty ports, was now opposed by a whole new generation who turned to someone like Chen Duxiu and the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party with the encouragement of Comintern. Very quickly, a whole generation of young students, particularly from the high schools and universities, turned to this another form of modernization, or westernization, if you like, but perfectly prepared to go all the way. And insofar as they were concerned, westernization or modernization had two parts to it. One was the liberal capitalists who were controlling the treaty ports and actually were making use of the former Mandarin elites of the past, and the vast majority of the Chinese people who gained nothing from it and from whom they could hope to get support. And of course, this is where the Chinese Revolution differed from that of the Soviet one right from the beginning, was that the Chinese was an agrarian society, and at that point it was probably 90% peasantry. And out of that, it was quite clear that to talk in terms of workers unite and so on was just nonsense. There were just not enough workers to unite to make any difference. But drawing upon the support of the peasantry, and something that this is where Mao Zedong's genius came out and took advantage of, when they were driven out of Shanghai by the Kuomintang after their victory in 1928, and they retreated to the countryside, they turned to the peasantry. And of course, in Jiangxi Soviet and the Long March, they were defeated, had a very bad time, they were actually losing. But the point is that they learned how to deal with the countryside. They learned how to fight, organize, and gain the support and sympathy of the peasantry, who felt totally neglected by what they considered to be the landlord property classes that were dominant in the Kuomintang government. So class differences, class struggle, as a phrase, took the place of nationalism in that context. So the battle then, in a way, simplified into two main ones. There were also some miscellaneous groups in between, but two main ones competed for the hearts and souls, as it were, hearts and minds of the people from that time onwards. Those who appealed to what they call the feudal classes and landlord classes of the coastal areas, and the vast majority of the peasant classes in between. So the peasant rebellion tradition of the Chinese emerged as the model of how a peasant rebellion has any chance at all of gaining power and gaining legitimacy in that kind of economy, agrarian economy. And Mao Zedong took advantage of that and built upon, in a way, highly historical Chinese examples, but of the losers, not of the winners who became the elites, but the losers who remained peasants all through history, to draw upon their numbers and their willingness to sympathize and support them in a different framework, and eventually, as we know, at least as I was saying to my friends earlier on, to everyone's surprise, after the victory against the Japanese and again the end of the Pacific War, and not strictly speaking a victory by the Chinese themselves, but with the help of the Americans and other allies, but the victory against the Japanese allowed the Chinese people to believe that nationalist China had won. And it was really to everyone's surprise that within 4 years, that nationalist China was defeated. And incidentally, when you talk in modern terms, it was defeated with none of the things that the new China of the First Revolution had talked about. They had no capitalist backers, there was no financial backing from the rich and the landlord classes, and certainly had no naval power of any kind whatsoever. They fought a victory of the People's Liberation Army entirely by land, without a single ship, without anything, not a single plane, not a single ship, and they won that war entirely on land, totally, in a way, in the highest traditional Chinese way, a peasant rebellion winning that war. To everyone's surprise, because the nationalists were supported by the Americans and the Allies, They were well armed. They had all the modern arms, the airplanes, the ship, and the shipping was in their hands. So that was how it all ended. So I'll leave it at that because one can go on. But the point I wanted to make was we've now introduced class struggle into the whole thing, and Mao Zedong was the winner, and basically started afresh. Now this I call it the revolution number 2, the second revolution. And this was a different one. It wasn't simply a political revolution of a system from dynastic to a republican state, but now to someone that wanted a total revolution of the mentality of the Chinese people, the cultural, social revolution that would change China altogether, cut off from the past and start afresh with a completely different world outlook. And I wouldn't go into that. I think that story is well known. I try to end by drawing a number of things. The thing is that Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution and all the things that led to the Cultural Revolution obviously failed, and the economy was in a desperate state when Deng Xiaoping came. And why I want to emphasize this particular change was because he brought back the word reforms. Enough of revolutions. We've had enough revolution, we're back to reforms. And as I said, the underlying principle of reform is that nothing wrong with the system, you just have to improve it. So any expectation that Deng Xiaoping was going to change China into some capitalist country was ridiculous. What Deng Xiaoping had in mind was that the socialist victory in 1949 was genuine. Mao Zedong made some mistakes. We now had to correct them and reform the system that was established in 1949 and make sure that the Communist Party will now succeed in doing what it was set out to do. I think that is quite clear. It was a kind of confidence that the party can be rescued. It was not too late to rescue the party and reform it so that it can become the legitimate, legitimate and transformed government of China. And I would say that from Deng Xiaoping down to Xi Jinping, this has remained the same idea, that the Communist Party was essential. The Communist Party won in 1949. It's a new mandate. The mandate is perfectly legitimate, and even though mistakes were made, all those mistakes can be changed and corrected and reformed. And Deng Xiaoping's confidence was, as it were, justified in emphasizing economic development, emphasizing adoption of an early stage of socialism through the use of capitalist methods to achieve a certain degree of capitalism so that you can have a socialist transformation. And that, I think, he never departed from. And none of his successors have. And I would say Xi Jinping remains the same. We may think of Xi Jinping as extreme in one form or the other, but I actually see him as absolutely part of that continuity. He was, in a way, reaffirming the victory of the Chinese Communist Party. Not Mao Zedong or any particular leader, but the Chinese Communist Party had set up a new kind of system. The system was that of what I would call a party nation. The party nation, where the party is now replaces the emperor. You don't have an emperor anymore, but the party represents the emperor. And from that party stems all power, all decisions to be made, and all the kind of control necessary to make sure that Chinese development path will remain on the line prescribed and that they will succeed. Again, I can go on, but I'll leave it at that simply to make some final few remarks. And that is that what I think we are facing today is not a China that is simply westernized by copying everything from the West. They're westernized and modernized because they're willing to learn everything from the West, but they want to be able to choose what they learn and what they don't want to learn. And they have made some choices, very obvious choices. What they have chosen to modernize, it seems to me, represents something like 80 to 90% of what has happened and what is still happening in China. What they decided not to take on, the 10 or 15% or so, of what they would say with what makes them Chinese. And so they come back to my first two words I used at the beginning, modernizing China. Modernizing is the first part of it. China remains the more important part. So that today we find scholars in China, many scholars in China, asking the question, what is China? It's not only outsiders who ask that. The Chinese themselves ask themselves, what is China? And of course, this is a big question. I could go into that and spend a lot of your time, but I won't go into that. I would say that there's some reflection of that old thing that I said at the first stage of reform, when Zhang Zhidong came to the conclusion that Western learning was for use, but Chinese learning was still the foundations. That still somewhat remains, but in a different form. In a different form is that it almost turned into Western learning, which are now adopted, is now become the foundations. But because we have learned them so well, we're so confident we know how to handle it, we can afford to say, but we will use Chinese traditions and Chinese continuities, Chinese history to make it more secure, to make our Chinese modernization more secure and identifiably Chinese. So I have a suggestion to make, and that is, it's not 中体西用, as Zhang Zhidong said, but 今古通用. The present and the past, both are usable to us. And what we do is what we choose from the present and what we choose from the past, we will choose them selectively to make sure that we do what is now necessary for any modern society, modern state to be dedicated to, and that is to the idea of progress. And one of the things that always struck me from the time I was young was the idea of progress having been accepted by the Chinese without any hesitation. Bearing in mind that the whole of Chinese tradition never had the concept of idea, never had the concept of progress. It was always looking to the past, a glorious past, a model from which we have drawn our wisdom from, and from which we must always turn to for our wisdom. They have actually accepted progress to say there is such a thing. Material progress is absolutely without question. Material progress must continue. And to achieve that, we must dedicate ourselves to the idea that we will get better and better. There's no question of looking to the past for any way of getting better. To get better, you must have the idea of progress. But to remain Chinese, you must be fully aware of where you came from. Where did the Chineseness come from? That continuity with the past, with all the Chinese records of the last 2,000 or 3,000 years have put down in writing for us to learn from, would provide us with all the lessons from history that will enable the Chinese to remain distinctively Chinese while being modern and progressive. And how do you symbolize that progress that the West had offered? You don't have to call it that anymore. You can pick on a sage for Confucius as a sage for the past, and Karl Marx will be the sage for the future. Doesn't mean that you're a Marxist in any literal sense, but Marx symbolizes, because Marx brought to the world the idea of progress in a form which is indisputable. And that he has laid down that the world will get better and better. The Chinese believe in that. That they have certainly accepted, and I would say that that is what makes the Chinese now say that their modern culture, their modern national culture is progressive and not at all afraid to be linked to the past of Confucian wisdoms and to the future of a Marxist way of thinking. Thank you very much.